You know, sequels are fascinating when you take the time to think about them. They are necessarily either an admission on the creator's behalf that the first entry was incomplete, or a grab for more money. Not to say that this devalues continuations. Oftentimes, sequels are used to re-examine prior entries and force the celebrated values from there to wrestle with new problems. It's from that struggle where ideas can become solidified, modulated, or replaced altogether. In KOTOR 1, we saw the ideological foundations of both Jedi and Sith cemented in axioms and their ethical ramifications explored in great detail. It was by design not a deep departure from Star Wars as we knew it, but still, it took the franchise further, which is doubly notable because mainstream intelligent Star Wars was very stagnant back then. This presented a massive problem for the KOTOR series going forwards. If KOTOR 1 was a loving celebration of Star Wars' greater potential, then where do we go next? Well, if you're Obsidian Entertainment, tasked with furthering the adventure, then you take the Empire Strikes Back approach. That movie was an effort by its director, Irving Kershner, to make up for the shortcomings of the previous movie by imbuing the characters with inner conflict and fleshing out the moral landscape. But not content with addressing the shortcomings of only its immediate predecessor, KOTOR 2 took a sledgehammer to much of the expanded Star Wars universe and shattered the false idol that recent years had made of its all-powerful deity, the Force. Knights of the Old Republic 2, The Sith Lords, is a scathing critique of Star Wars' innate limitations, and it set a new high watermark for the series, which is not hard to argue, is still its peak. Hi, I'm AesirAesthetics, and in this video we'll be talking about KOTOR 2 in depth. For the production of this video, I recorded a 69-minute long discussion with its lead designer, Chris Avellone, and if you're interested in what he had to say, I have a link to it in the description box of this video. Alternatively, you can just go on my channel and find it. It was a great conversation, and I can't thank Mr. Avellone enough for taking the time out of his busy schedule to do it with me. Needless to say, his views have immensely informed the direction of this video, and if you come away from it with a newfound appreciation of the game, or hell, Star Wars itself, be sure to credit that to him and the team at Obsidian. With all of these formalities out of the way, let's get started. KOTOR 2 launched in December 2004 on PCs and the original Xbox. It continued the story of the previous games' world, but from an entirely new perspective. Gone are Revan, Karth, and Bastila, and in their place we have Mitra Zurich, the Jedi exile, Atton Rand, and Kreia. While the critical reception of the era seems to pretty consistently assert that this game surpassed the original in writing, the actual nuts and bolts of gameplay received a thrashing. A well-deserved thrashing because the thing was incomplete at launch. Let's go back a bit. See, after KOTOR 1 knocked it out of the park sales-wise, it made no sense to delay the production of a sequel. So Lucasarts came to Bioware with a proposition that Bioware refused, later citing an undesirable time window for production and their own desires to start focusing on franchises they could own. But Bioware's breakup with Lucasarts wasn't bitter. They might have declined the offer, but quickly suggested that Obsidian be given a crack at the job. The people over at Obsidian had some history with the people over at Bioware working on the Infinity Engine, yada 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 Baldur's Gate, Icewind Dale, yada 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 Planescape Torment, hey, LucasArts, these are the guys and gals for the job. Obsidian was a new studio at the time, so one can imagine that getting their hands on a franchise with this sort of clout was very advantageous in that it helped them get their feet firmly grounded. After the contract was signed, Obsidian got to work, and at some point in development, they came to believe, because of some producer miscommunication, that they could be given an extension of 3 months to more fully realize their vision. But soon before the game's original launch date, the management over at LucasArts changed, and since the original contract had not actually been amended, it was decided that the game would launch as initially planned. This was one of the numerous decisions made under Jim Ward's leadership of LucasArts, which saw the entire studio stripped to the bone in an effort to get control over its messy management. Obsidian lost 3 months of development because of this, and a planet's worth of content had to be gutted. What released to the masses was a buggy and clearly unfinished product, which might well have spelled the death of the KOTOR franchise then and there, but Everyone could see that there was a lot of merit to it, and it wasn't far from the surface. This is where we must give kudos to the content restoration mod and the amazing team which brought it into existence. This mod is the game's life support system. In continuing the story of KOTOR 1, Obsidian decided that it wasn't necessary to overhaul the game in any major way. The Odyssey engine is back, and what was to play with in the first game is refined to some extent to better serve a new central aspiration. There's no more level cap, there's an increase in the smoothness of the visual presentation, improved lighting, but not much else. The systems Bioware designed to present the story of the original KOTOR really didn't need much retooling when you get right down to it, but I'm not so in love with it that I'm gonna ignore the development time variable. I'm sure that if Obsidian had had an extra year on this project, they might have considered tweaking a few more things under the hood. A standard practice for people who like to study games is to pay special attention to openings, because they are the developer's clearest expression of their central intent. It's in the opening that they prime you for the entire experience and set up all the necessary mechanisms that justify to a player the prospect of continual progression. KOTOR 2's opening is widely regarded to be not this. Not because the opening is some sort of disaster like a lot of the fanbase insists that it is, but rather because it's just not super indicative of the experience to come. See, the central goal of the game, according to my friend Chris, first name Basis, was addressing the franchise's philosophical limitations. The opening doesn't really do that. I think it does a great job of setting tone, what with the dark mining facility, but then it just meanders for like an hour on the DMV-like planet of Telos. The problem with this planet is that it railroads the player to take a side in a very linear and backtrack-heavy quest with so little room for deviation that subsequent playthroughs have people installing the skip mod. No joke, they made that. When we left the canonical conclusion of KOTOR 1, we saw that Revan had regained his memories, redeemed Bastila, and brought down Malak. The end scene evoked A New Hope's award ceremony, and just when the music couldn't swell any higher, credits. That game ended on a high note, with the galaxy's future seemingly being brighter than ever before. When we played KOTOR 2, we found out that Revan pretty much bailed, the Sith came back stronger and wiped out the Jedi, that the galaxy is just about to discard the beleaguered and tired body of the Republic, and that instability is at an all-time high. And as if that wasn't enough, the Sith are actively chasing us because they believe we're the last of the Jedi. An understandable mistake, but we had actually been exiled after the Mandalorian War, set several years prior to the events of this series, where Revan and Malak betrayed the Jedi Order and took a bunch of Jedi with them to confront the Mandalorian threat tearing through the galaxy. Our main character in this game is Mitra Zurich, but we'll just refer to her as the Jedi Exile from now on. She is the Jedi Exile because she chose to fight with Revan in that war and eventually caused the Malachor 5 Shadow Generator incident. This saw numerous Jedi and Mandalorians slaughtered for the sake of a decisive final blow. When the Jedi Council exiled our protagonist, they also stripped away her connection to the Force. At least that's what she thinks. In reality, the pain of Malachor 5 was so great that she cut herself off from the Force in order to survive the ordeal. This act makes the Exile immensely attractive as a pupil to one of gaming's most beloved characters, Kreia. She joins us almost immediately on our journey and even forfeits one of her hands so that we, her, and Aten Rand can escape Darth Sion. During our escape, we blow up the mining facility, which is why we're taken to Telos. I don't want to say that this opening is bad, because there's a lot I genuinely like about it. I like how the game frontloads us with this mini-section where we play as T3M4 fixing the Eppenhawk, and I also liked uncovering what happened on the mining facility and how Sion and his assassins made their way to us. There are some gruesome details, but they're undoubtedly wrapped up in a very linear package. This is a complaint I think applies more so to this game's opening than the first game's Terrace, because on Terrace we had a new thing to do every 5 minutes. Although that level was arguably about as linear as Telos, at least it had some visual and gameplay diversity. Here, that's just not true. But for a first-timer, this isn't a big deal. The lack of choice only becomes a problem when you're going through the second time. What's more problematic for people wanting to play the game is that the game plays very differently from what we expect a video game of this kind to play like today. But before I talk about that, I'm going to be going over the rest of the game's story briefly. After our main crew is introduced, we are finally given a proper heading when we meet Atris. This is something else I thought the opening to KOTOR 1 did better. At no point in that game's opening was it not apparent why we were doing what we were doing, whereas in this game, we first go to Telos because we're under arrest, and then we're let go, but our ship was stolen, so now we need to gain allies to get another ship to take us to our old ship, and that has us meet Baldur for some reason. But it all gets great when we meet Atris. If you haven't played the game yourself, then you might be familiar with her mostly from the marketing material where she was on all of the posters. This, along with some unearthed thumbnails and models, led many people, myself included, to assume that her role was originally much more extensive. As is, she introduces our character's past, because the exile and her know one another. It's from talking to her that we can get an idea of who the exile was and what her story is. It's also from Atris that we get our goal of reuniting the remaining Jedi Masters on the ruin of Dantooine's Jedi Enclave. This is spurred when we tell her that the Sith are back, and throughout our adventure we'll come to contact with them from time to time. After expanding our party and finding all of the Jedi Masters, that lived, anyway, we're betrayed when they decide to cut us off from the Force for real. Kreia saves us by killing the lot of them and then proceeds to Malachor 5 to finish some of her own plans. This starts the final act of the game where we take down Darth Nihilus, Darth Sion, and the mysterious Darth Kreia. Afterwards we set off in search of Revan and the true Lords of the Sith. At least, that was the idea for the next game, but LucasArts was restructuring at the time, remember? That's because they didn't want to be dependent on third-party developers handling their franchises. This was what made a KOTOR 3 gradually not materialize, and now, 15 years later, we know precious little more about the direction that game would have taken than what I provided just now. Taken on its own, however, KOTOR 2 is a very solid conclusion to the Knights of the Old Republic story. It satisfactorily answers most questions it raised and did so without falling back on established works. And if we never get a third game, then we can take the allusions the game makes about the dangers lurking in the larger universe as storytelling mechanisms, whose true purpose is to make the Star Wars we know feel small, making us question just how much of the space opera has been eluding us. Two noteworthy changes from the first game, which I've briefly touched on already, are the levels being larger and how we aren't searching for star maps, but rather Jedi. The larger levels part is noteworthy because it isn't universally true. The returning levels of Dantooine and Korriban being smaller than they were before should be noted, but the sentiment feeling like it has weight is still interesting. I think the levels give off that feeling because there is much more connective tissue tying the levels together here than in the first game, and the stressed focus on more interesting main stories makes the levels feel much larger. Most of your playtime in the first game was probably the side quests, which stretched the duration of each planet, but the main quest is what takes up most of our time in this one. I'd say that each main planet feels 50% more dense with meaningful/impressive content, but that's a personal take. Don't let it color your experience. The compass change is noteworthy because of its ramifications. I refer to these main goals as our compasses because they are what we are always moving towards in a given level. In the previous game, we searched for fragments of a map that would lead us to the Starforge. That setup worked well for that game in terms of both narrative and in terms of anchoring our goal to something immediately approachable. The story ramification of the change is that now our compass points to people rather than objects. In the first game, Revan didn't really grow as a character in any sense because he found the star maps, Those were just necessary locks on content to ensure the player experienced the Star Wars universe. Here, the exile has conflict, which she brings with her when she finally confronts the Jedi Masters, and it really makes her feel more developed than Revan was in the first game. She believes that they stripped her of the Force, and the player's decision on how to deal with the Jedi has important ramifications for the exile's development. Do you want to gather them together to face the Sith threat, or do you want to kill them for exiling you and stripping you of the Force? Again, that's not true, but it's what the exile believes. The real reason they exiled her was because of her actions on Malachor 5. They believed that in the aftermath, she had become a wound in the Force. They believed that she carried the deaths of Malachor 5 within her, and that she leached on both death and the life energy of all that surrounds her. If you're anything like me, then you enjoy seeing game and story as one, and in KOTOR 2, the reason we attract our party is because the exile naturally forms bonds. The Jedi Masters believed that this passive ability of hers would ultimately be the end of the Jedi, as she would slowly leech off their life force and the life force of all whom she engaged with, until finally she would be the death of the Force. The party system is as simple as what I've put on screen so far. 3 members, including the exile. They all fight for a bit and have some other exceptionalities, like computers. The big change from the first game is that the party is more restrictive. There are large sections where you're locked with at least one party member. To the more choice equals better mentality, this should be a net negative, but this is a mentality I don't prescribe to, and this game is a good example of why. The more guided experience ensures that we've actually had some dealings with the people we're surrounded with. In the first game, there was no real motivation to experiment or get to know the entire team other than just wanting to do that. And that led to an experience where most players would be exclusively using the Force wielders. Also helping the party in this game stand out is the fact that most of them can be trained as Jedi, giving you both more powerful allies as well as the incentive to extensively engage with them. And that engagement is very worthwhile. The characters are fleshed out enough that you want to know what secrets they're all keeping. Something I didn't note in my video on the first game is that the Force abilities aren't locked behind the same system as the story branching. If you want to reduce penalties from dark side powers, then you need to be evil and do dark side things, but you can still get the good ending. That carries over into this game, and it's faithful to the idea that there isn't actually a dark side of the Force so much as there is the Force, and dark-minded people will use it differently. The Emperor's lightning in episode 6 wasn't because he unlocked level 13 of Sith. Assumably, Obi-Wan and Yoda could have done that as well, but since they weren't evil gits hell-bent on spreading misery, they just didn't. The changed goal from evoking Star Wars whilst feeling unique to addressing the franchise's philosophical restrictions meant that the same old game had to be slightly refocused to fit a new design sensibility. Most of the presentation remaining the same speaks to the strong foundation laid by Bioware, but it's also true that this game doesn't really tell the story so much as it just gets you between dialogue sections which do. But the tweaks to gameplay are still worth observing. The planets being more involved, more party members, and no restriction on levels, because Obsidian might have seen that as a roadblock against players fully excavating the material innate to this game. Like a lot of the most beloved sequels, KOTOR 2 is darker than its predecessor, and in its attempt to address the franchise's philosophical limitations, it shows us scenarios where the old binary moralities aren't good enough. The world is no longer permeated with the feeling of adventure, but rather subjugation. The Jedi are looked at as failures and losers. The extent to which criminality runs rampant is much greater than in the first game, and, most notably, the Republic feels like it's entered its final days. The reason binary moralities don't work anymore is because of Kreia. She's constantly hanging around and nitpicking our decisions, pointing out how wasteful our conduct really is. That might have gotten annoying after a while, but her criticisms of the Force and its practitioners is actually very poignant. If the Force is good, then why do the Nar Shaddaa refugees suffer so much? Why did the Jedi Sith War bring low so many worlds, and just how much longer can the galaxy really take it? A Darth Nihilus is a galaxy-wide threat, easily on par with the Death Star, and he's just a guy. Imagine how easy it would be to create an army of him and wipe out everything. A single rotten egg is enough to spoil the entire batch, as the galaxy saw with Exar Kun, Revan and Malak, and now with the Exile, or so the Jedi Masters fear. And what's more is that the Jedi, so-called Guardians of Peace, are led by an ideology which makes it impossible for them to adequately deal with the issues of gone-wrong Force wielders. The best they can do is take them while they're children to secure that they don't form emotional attachments, and then raise them in an orthodoxy of emotional repression and strict dogma. KOTOR 2's world is very believable in a sense, because this is how it might be if the ideological battles of the Jedi and Sith really played out. And because the members of both religions failed to examine thoroughly their own teachings, they failed to improve and doomed themselves to more failure. On Dantooine we see the ruins of the Jedi Enclave, and yep, that makes sense. On Korriban we see the ruins of the Sith Academy, and again, yep, obviously that would happen. The idea of a collective not re-examining its fault is also present in the other groups we see. The Mandalorians are rebuilt by Canderous Ordo, but there's nothing really changed about their underlying philosophy. Canderous believes that the reason they lost to the Jedi was because they weren't prepared for Force wielders, but that they've since improved. This idea is preposterous in the face of it, but it also hides another flaw with the Mandalorians, in that the idea of glory through combat is doomed to failure. People don't want to fight if they can help it. The criminal element isn't re-examining itself either. In fact, it's quite the opposite. On top of the crime hierarchy, we have Godo, whose entire spiel seems to be more efficiency. Instead of acknowledging the innate issues the criminal world has, it's just made itself more capable of maintaining itself. In a galaxy with robots, it makes a lot of sense that if you run the criminal world experiment for long enough, that eventually it would be run by a hyper-efficient algorithm. The Republic being on its last legs is also pretty believable. The magnitude of differences between cultures here, on Earth, makes it hard for us to come together, so imagine how ludicrous a proposition it is that a single government can be maintained on a galactic scale. Practically speaking, it's just an insane project. The Jedi don't have any mechanism to properly deal with dissenters. Their teachings revolve around emotional disassociation and absolute adherence to the will of the Force. But the Force being deterministic means that it decided the fate of all the galaxy's previous wars, and in fact, it decided that those wars ought to be. The Jedi are therefore worshipping a very morally warped entity, and so are the Sith. They believe in the Force as a tool to further their own self-determination, but they are reliably self-destructive. Their paranoia eventually makes them crave power for its own sake, and it turns them against one another. All of the major players of this world are stagnant. They find themselves continually fighting the same battles, and no one wants to admit that there's something fundamentally wrong with the world. This is why Kreia is so important to the Star Wars mythos. Kreia is easily a more intellectually complicated character than anything we've seen from the movies so far, timestamp, and are likely to see from them anytime soon. She's kind of a self-insert of Chris Avallone's, in that she speaks to all of the narrative and world-building inadequacies he observed. It's possible that such a character could only be born in video game format, or at least interactive format, because he's very observant to how systems drive behaviors and about digging up knowledge. I can't understate how important I think the mediums he's presented in matters when understanding her, nor can I understate how important I think it is to understand her teachings, that she was an analog for one of our medium's most accomplished designers. In fact, that's how I feel about most of the game's cast. They're all very poignant observations about this galaxy. You might miss that because you never chose not to have Kreia in your team, but The other characters are pulling their own weight, for the most part. I particularly like how we learn that Revan's most loyal ally from the first game turns out to have been Canderous Ordo? Not to say that Karth and Bastila's efforts with the Republic aren't commendable, but Canderous is single-handedly willing the Mandalorians back to life in order for the galaxy to have protectors for when the true Sith decide to strike. Something else worth bringing up when examining the main party is that they are a spin on Star Wars conventions. I didn't really ask Avellone whether this was deliberate, but he has done this before to great success. See Planescape Torment. Atton is decisively the Han Solo character, but he has tragedy behind him. He was a Jedi hunter under Darth Revan, and he killed a Jedi who had fallen in love with him. Visas Mar is another great spin, and specifically she's an alternative to the Sith apprentice. Usually the Sith wear pitch-black robes and are raised on a diet of hatred and abuse. This often turns them into power-hungry animals, but Visas Mar isn't? She wears a, comparative to most Sith, flamboyant outfit, and she's vulnerable. The abuse her master doled out on her didn't make her crave power, it made her weaker. And it's through interacting with the exile that her wounds begin to mend, and that's actually true of most of our party. I already talked a bit about Canderous, but what's important to note about him is that this is the first time we see a dignified Mandalorian actually act like the Mandalorians are talked about in Legends. Boba Fett was a low-life bounty hunter. He might have had some code about not killing children or whatever, but he was not a dignified warrior, not by a long shot, and his inability to form a greater Mandalorian culture around him speaks to his failures at keeping the Mandalorians alive. This game actually has us revisiting the degraded Mandalorian scavengers and thugs for hire we saw in the last game, and offering them to be a part of something greater than themselves in the restoration of the Mandalorian tribe. So for once, we see the Mandalorians in the Star Wars universe behaving not as some scummy political terrorists or punished war legends, but actually behaving like Mandalorians, working towards a common goal with their proud warrior ethic intact. According to Avellone, Obsidian recognized that much of what made Knights of the Old Republic great was the story and the companions, and they tried to expand upon this by adding more depth to them. I would consider them to have been successful in that attempt, but something I do need to bring up is the Kreia problem. The characters here are very interesting when you get involved with them on a deeper level, but that's not likely to happen in the first playthrough, because you never want Kreia not to be in your party, and very often the third party member is predetermined by the game. The predetermined companion is a good correction to the problem in the first game where players would only use the Force wielder allies, but it comes with the downside that truly unique parties are not going to appear as often. I'm obviously not going to say that without noting that there are numerous times where you segue between 2-3 person parties, but I still feel like there's a bit more needed for each character to truly pop, and if you'll indulge my theorizing, this issue might have been solved if Obsidian had had the time to put the final planet into the game. Especially since it had been a droid planet, so the 3 machine companions could have gotten more play. But there's no use in dwelling what could have been. As is, the game has numerous truly great companions who unfortunately just have to stand in the shadow of one of the truly great video game characters. The fact that the game rejects archaic and rigid moral thinking means that defining the villains of the game is a bit tricky. I would say that in the grand scheme of things, the Sith, the Jedi, and Kreia are the villains, because if not for us, they would all lead the galaxy to darker places. The Sith are eating planets and slaughtering millions. The Jedi wanted to depower the exile, thereby making it impossible to stop the Sith, and Kreia's adherence to her goal is such that she would kill the entire galaxy to preserve the exile. The challenges these villains present to us as a player is mostly wrapped up in that central package of re-examining core Star Wars values. Atris is the final Jedi historian, and she fell to the dark side as she tried to understand the teachings of the Sith holocrons she'd collected. Her desire was simply to understand why the Jedi are so easily swayed by the lure of the darkness. She sought knowledge that might serve as a final pillar of a new Jedi philosophy, one so strong that no one would be tempted by the darkness again. This was the journey which Kreia took many years ago. She was also a Jedi historian who knew that there were issues with the doctrine. She also attempted to fix it by asking tough questions and examining forbidden knowledge. When Kreia fell, she took the identity of Darth Kreia and became the head of the Sith Triumvirate. Atris is not that far gone yet, however. She surrounded herself with handmaidens who were deaf to the call of the Force so that no one could suspect her research, but she's yet to accept her fall. She does after Kreia visits her, and this is where Atris in essence takes up Kreia's old mantle of Darth Kreia. We see in Atris' story that there is danger in uprooting one's value structure. In this game, it's true that without a moral anchor, one's blind observation of the abyss will have the abyss gaze back. And without a bang or a proper notice, you'll become an embodiment of something you know you should detest. Darth Nihilus is another cautionary tale. The man behind the mask was a miraculous survivor of the Malachor 5 incident, but he survived in body alone. With his friends and family all dead, he had truly lost everything that reinforced his identity. The incident also made him a wound in the Force, so he would hunger incessantly, and it was only when Kreia taught him how to feed his hunger that he gained any semblance of direction again. But it was all in service of feeding his ever-growing hunger. He hungers specifically for life, and thankfully his moral nihilism makes it so that he has no qualms about slaughtering entire planets. But the name Nihilus comes from nihilism and annihilation, and that second part is often overlooked. This guy is essentially the full realization of a very warped Sith idea. What happens when your existence is the pursuit of satisfying your hunger? Annihilation. And there's nothing behind him beyond his hunger, nothing more concrete to latch onto. There's no framework through which to reason with him, to show him how his actions are in contrast to his values. He has none. And even if he had any, how would one go about communicating with him? He speaks through the Force in a language whose lexicon seems to consist solely of pain. But he's not what Kreia is looking for. Kreia wants someone who can resist the Force's will, and Darth Nihilus isn't that. Darth Nihilus is someone whose existence is dependent on the Force because without it, he could not sustain himself. This is one of those great characters who's very franchise dependent. He needs the pre-existing rules and ethic of the Star Wars universe to function because he is at his core a very uncomfortable extreme of taking those rules seriously. That being said, I wish he didn't take so much of the spotlight away from what I consider to be his more interesting comrade, Darth Sion. Darth Sion is what happens when aggression is the only thing you live for, when it molds your morality and becomes your master. Sion is another character who showcases the extreme danger of not rejecting the Force. He was originally struck down in Exar Kun's Great Sith War, but he managed to stay alive by calling upon pain, anger, and hatred. He lives in continued agony and is motivated by the hatred he calls upon to stay alive. The reason I think he's more interesting than Nihilus is because he's a much more human character. Nihilus seems to have nothing left of his prior identity. In old canon, he had actually transformed his soul into the mask as his body had rotted beyond rescue. But Sion has nothing left but his identity, if that makes any sense. His motivations are completely internal, and he's facing a losing proposition every second of the day. If he rejects the anger in favor of true values, then he will cease to exist. But if he accepts the anger, then he will live in abject agony. And there's an additional layer of tragedy to him because he desperately wants the one thing he cannot have. The name Sion comes from Scion, which means heir, but his master is Kreia and he will never have her approval. Kreia's respect is reserved for those who can reject the Force's will, and Sion is literally unable to, so he will forever be denied the only thing that he believes could justify the agony. The reason for our ability to defeat him is that Sion had formed an attraction to the exile, so he was able to talk to her for long enough for himself to realize that his life of agony was ultimately a life of permanent weakness and dependence, and he decided ultimately to reject that in favor of death. Kreia is quite possibly the best character in this entire expanded franchise, bar maybe just Revan. To call her a grey Jedi is missing the point. She's neither grey nor a Jedi. To call her a nihilist is also missing the point. She does believe in some objective values. Like I noted earlier, Kreia was once a Jedi historian. Assumably, she was Aaron Kai, Revan's first and final teacher, although Chris Avellone seems to want that to be left ambiguous. She was exiled first by the Jedi and later by the Sith. She had always been skeptical about strict dogmas, but eventually she came to believe that the Force was fundamentally cold. It was uncaring and obviously sinister in nature. If it was a god, then it was a god who had no qualms about manipulating sentient creatures in its game of galactic balance. Kreia understood this because she saw the unnecessary deaths brought about by the will of the Force and refused to give the Jedi or Sith an easy opt-out. The Force may work in mysterious ways, but that's cold comfort to the suffering children whose cries for help are never answered. Furthermore, however, Kreia understood that the salvation of the galaxy would start with the death of the Force. Only when people could freely choose their own fate could the never-ending cycle of wanton destruction be ended. Our relationship with Kreia is built on her love of the exile. Side note, this is one of the reasons for why I prefer the exile to be a woman. In the male playthrough, the final chapters make Kreia come across as kinda Oedipusy. I know that Kreia is not talking about romantic or sexual love, but, I still get the creepy vibes. Kreia saw the unending causality of pain and misery and noted that the Force's determinism wasn't benign. The unjust suffering in the world was all the Force's will in its sinister game of galactic balance. There was no light in any of this, and it's not that there was a dark side of the Force. To Kreia, it was all dark. According to Kreia's teachings, the deterministic nature of the Force makes this completely redeemable. In fact, due to the deterministic nature of the Force, this is beyond moral condemnation. If the Force is truth, then Anakin really did nothing wrong. That's why Kreia loves the exile so much. The exile is proof to Kreia that not only should the Force be rejected, but that it was possible to reject the Force. After watching The Last Jedi be killed and defeating Atris, Darth Nihilus, and Darth Sion, the exile finally confronted and defeated Kreia. In her final moments, Kreia tells us of the visions she's had, which inform us somewhat on the future of our companions, and then she explains her love for the exile as I just talked about. Since this game is at its core a critique of the franchise's philosophical limitations, it makes sense that our hero is someone who denies the easy story in favor of the meaningful one. Our hero is someone who rejects the Force's will and seeks to control their own destiny. What's interesting in observing Kreia's final pupil is that she's the realization of the other side of the coin that was Kreia's greatest pupil, Revan. Revan was the first blueprint for the true path. A path which rejected the dead ends embodied by the villains of this game. Revan sought to keep the infrastructure alive while he waged war with the true Sith. Kreia was proud of him because he was able to harness the Force as a tool to enact his own will without being absorbed by the dark side. He wasn't an evil man, nor was he a puppet. If the exile shows one could live without the Force, then Revan proves that it was possible to live with the Force. A true hero in this world is therefore someone who rejects the limited frameworks of Days Gone and seeks to control their own destiny rather than get absorbed by orthodoxy. More so than merely serve as a vector for the player, the exile serves to break the loop on the philosophical crisis of the game. The exile shows us that the Force can be denied, that kindness and good nature can indeed be elevated into proper virtues without forfeiting one's individuality into the fray. And what's most refreshing about this is that it can be done without falling back on the conventional slave morality of the Jedi or the master morality of the Sith. KOTOR 1 was a loving celebration of everything Star Wars was and could be, but KOTOR 2 is the opposite swing of the pendulum. It's a scathing, ruthless, and cutting critique of Star Wars' inadequacies. It points out the shortcomings that have stayed with the franchise from its inception, and throughout its playtime it rips out with its root any deeply held dogma. Jedi equals good? No, not inherently. Often they're just mindless drones who steal children and do nothing as the almighty Force dictates where tragedy shall strike next. Force equals tool to examine the philosophical underpinnings of our characters? Yes, but not exclusively. It's also an insidious puppet master which seems to revel at the sight of misery. The KOTOR franchise was the story of Revan, and how his choices shaped the entire galaxy. His will echoes through causality and nearly broke the world, but he knew what he was doing. He knew that he had left the galaxy in good hands. Now, we just continue to wait for the exile to find him and give him aid in his battles against the true Sith Lords. What I think is interesting about the prospect of this series being revived is that it'd likely mirror the transition we saw with Fallout. It's not necessarily going to be as extensive, seeing as the jump from Fallout 2 to Fallout 3 saw an entire dimension added to the presentation, which threw off the entire balance that had worked before, but what is likely going to happen again, if KOTOR 3 ever happens, is that KOTOR 3 will be played and presented fairly differently from the way KOTOR 1 and 2 are. Design sensibilities have continued to evolve from this, and these segmented, semi-boxy levels with 4 things to do in them aren't really indicative of how games are presented anymore. Probably a KOTOR 3 would exclude in-level loading screens, and it'd probably remove the pause function from the combat as well as the tactical move selector. Instead, it'd likely be more twitch action with a focus on the Force's interaction with the environment and combatants. I don't think the dialogue would change much, probably it could work the same, but have improved animations. This is interesting to me, because I wonder how connected to this game a theoretical sequel could ultimately be. It didn't sell as well as its predecessor, and it wasn't complete at launch. It took more than 10 years for this game to be fully realized thanks to the amazing modding community. Would it really be possible to just expect the player to pick up the game from where we ended here? With the Exile being as powerful as he is at this game's end? Who knows? Here's what I do know, however. After spending a few months with this franchise, I can say that this game is the bedrock. I haven't experienced all of Star Wars, but from what I've engaged with, I can say that this game defines everything about this license I hold in high regard now. It's the fullest realization of Star Wars, and it's the metric by which I compare all other things Star Wars. If there could only be one Star Wars story, I know I'd be rooting for it to be this one. If KOTOR 1 shows us that Star Wars can work as a game, then KOTOR 2 shows us that Star Wars can work better as a game. And with that, we'll be winding this experience down. The footage I used was supplied by Official Movie Games, Lorerunner, and the original movies. As you know, I have all of the conventional YouTuber links, that is, Twitter, where I'm most active in dishing out details regarding upcoming projects. On Patreon, I throw out to patrons any secrets and long-form plans I have in the works, and I've also got my podcast where, get this, guys talk about video games. All of these are linked in the description box below. Special thanks go out to Chris Avellone and the good people over at Obsidian Entertainment. I also want to give a thanks to you guys. I don't know if I could have wrangled Mr. Avellone to give me an hour of his time if I didn't have the 7,000 of you to give credence to my requests. I hope this video has been worth the hour you spent watching it, and I hope it, much like the game did for the first KOTOR, satisfactorily explored what was left to explore. I'm AesirAesthetics. Thanks for watching. Until next time. Oh, And be sure to fiddle around with the bells and whistles around the video because it helps it gain traction, I believe. Even if you just want to be the 90th person to make fun of my accent, it still counts. It still counts to the engagement metric. For real this time, take care.